Mike Tyson's story is far more complicated than the image of the terrifying heavyweight champion who once seemed capable of defeating anyone in front of him. His journey began in Brownsville, Brooklyn, where poverty, insecurity, violence, and loneliness shaped his earliest years. As a vulnerable child who struggled with his appearance and confidence, Tyson found comfort in pigeons, discovering in them a rare sense of peace. The loss of a beloved bird at the hands of a bully became a deeply emotional turning point, awakening an anger that would later become central to his identity. Yet beneath the aggression was a frightened child searching for safety, belonging, and approval. His rise from that environment to the highest level of boxing was extraordinary, but the emotional wounds of his childhood never simply disappeared. Cus D'Amato and the making of a fighter. Tyson's transformation began when legendary trainer Cus D'Amato recognized that the troubled teenager in front of him was not simply violent or undisciplined. D'Amato saw fear, insecurity, and enormous potential that could be redirected through structure and discipline. In the modest gym in Catskill, Tyson found something he had desperately needed: guidance from a father figure who believed in him. Training became intensely demanding, with endless repetition, conditioning, footwork, head movement, and the peekaboo defensive style. Tyson pushed himself beyond ordinary limits because boxing represented more than a career. It offered him a chance to become someone worthy of respect and affection. D'Amato helped turn Tyson's fear into focus and his aggression into a controlled athletic weapon. Their relationship became one of the most important foundations of Tyson's life, giving purpose to a young man who had previously struggled to find direction. The youngest heavyweight champion. Tyson's professional rise was remarkably fast. He entered the heavyweight division with unusual speed, movement, power, and precision, overwhelming opponents who were far more experienced. In 1986, at only 20 years old, he defeated Trevor Berbick to become the youngest heavyweight champion in boxing history, a record that still stands. His performances against elite opponents such as Larry Holmes and Michael Spinks established him as one of the most intimidating forces the sport had ever witnessed. Tyson did not simply possess tremendous punching power. His footwork allowed him to close distance rapidly, his defensive movement made him difficult to hit, and his combinations often ended fights before opponents could establish a rhythm. His reputation grew with every victory, eventually transforming him into one of the most recognizable athletes in the world. Yet the same success that made Tyson famous also began creating a dangerous distance between his public identity and the vulnerable person underneath it. Success without the person who built it. The death of Cus D'Amato came at a crucial moment in Tyson's development. The trainer who had provided discipline, emotional support, and a sense of family was no longer present when Tyson reached the summit of heavyweight boxing. Without that stabilizing influence, Tyson became increasingly surrounded by promoters, advisors, celebrities, and people who benefited from his enormous earning power. The world saw an unstoppable champion, but privately he was dealing with grief, insecurity, and isolation. Championship belts, money, attention, and fame could not replace the person whose approval he had valued most. This created a painful contradiction. Tyson had achieved the success he had worked toward, yet the person he most wanted to share it with was gone. The larger his public image became, the more difficult it became for him to separate the feared persona of Iron Mike from the human being who still carried unresolved childhood wounds. The loss of invincibility. Tyson's defeat by Buster Douglas in 1990 shattered the image of invincibility that had surrounded him. Douglas entered the fight carrying his own grief and personal motivation, while Tyson appeared less focused and less physically sharp than during his peak. When Douglas stopped him, the world witnessed something it had rarely imagined: Tyson on the canvas, vulnerable and defeated. The loss was more than the end of an unbeaten aura. It demonstrated that physical dominance could never guarantee permanent control over life. Tyson's difficulties outside the ring soon became even more serious, eventually resulting in imprisonment and a prolonged absence from boxing. During his time behind bars, he was separated from the wealth, attention, and entourage that had surrounded him. He had to confront himself without the distractions of fame: reading, reflection, and spiritual exploration became part of his attempt to understand the person he had become and the consequences of his choices. Public collapse and personal turmoil. After returning to boxing, Tyson regained much of his fame, but struggled to regain the stability that had characterized his earliest development under D'Amato. His rematch with Evander Holyfield in 1997 became one of the most infamous moments in sports history, when Tyson bit Holyfield during the contest and was disqualified. The incident was indefensible, but it also illustrated how severely Tyson's emotional control had deteriorated under pressure. His frustration, anger, physical exhaustion, and accumulated personal struggles erupted in front of a global audience. Around the same period, his personal relationships were also under intense public scrutiny. His short marriage to Robin Givens became a highly publicized and deeply troubled relationship, with both individuals describing serious emotional difficulties. The experience reinforced the painful divide between Tyson's intimidating public persona and his inability to find stability in private life. Fame had given him enormous visibility, but it had not given him the emotional tools needed to manage conflict, trust, intimacy, or vulnerability. Learning to live beyond the ring. Over time, Tyson's life began moving in a different direction. His relationship with Lakeha Kiki Spicer became an important part of that transition, offering a more grounded environment as he attempted to rebuild himself. The challenge was no longer defeating opponents, but learning how to live without constantly responding to the world through fear and aggression. Family, fatherhood, responsibility, and ordinary routines became increasingly important. For someone who had spent much of his life surrounded by conflict, peace itself became a form of discipline. Tyson had to learn that vulnerability did not automatically mean weakness, and that not every quiet moment represented danger. The transformation was gradual rather than perfect. His past could not simply be erased, and his mistakes remained part of his history. Nevertheless, his later years demonstrate an effort to understand those mistakes rather than allowing them to define every part of his identity. The body eventually collects. Its debt. Boxing gave Tyson extraordinary physical abilities, but the sport also demanded a tremendous price from his body. The explosive movement, relentless training, powerful punches, and years of competition placed enormous stress on his joints, muscles, spine, and nervous system. As he aged, physical problems became increasingly visible, including episodes of severe nerve pain and mobility difficulties. Images of Tyson using assistants to move around were striking because they contrasted so sharply with memories of the young champion whose legs and footwork were central to his dominance. Time, however, affects every athlete, regardless of past greatness. The body that once seemed almost invincible eventually showed the accumulated consequences of a demanding career and decades of physical strain. Tyson's aging became a reminder that athletic immortality is impossible. The strongest competitor eventually has to confront limitations that cannot be solved through training, determination, or punching power. The legacy of the man behind the myth. Mike Tyson's lasting legacy cannot be reduced to knockout victories, championship belts, wealth, controversy, or the frightening reputation that once defined him. His life illustrates how extraordinary talent can coexist with deep emotional wounds, and how fame cannot automatically heal the experiences that created a person. The frightened child from Brownsville became a legendary champion, but the adult Tyson eventually had to confront the fear and insecurity that had existed long before the championship years. His greatest challenge came after the crowds disappeared, when he had to live with the consequences of his decisions: damaged relationships, lost fortune, aging, and the physical cost of boxing. His story ultimately suggests that strength is not only the ability to overpower an opponent, it can also mean accepting responsibility, rebuilding trust, surviving failure, and learning to live without constantly needing conflict. Tyson's most meaningful victory may therefore be his ongoing effort to find peace after spending so much of his life believing that survival required him to fight.